All right, we're definitely recording now. All right, so today what we want to talk about is we're still in the 50s. We'll be exiting the 50s early next week. But we want to talk about the reaction again to rock and roll on the part of parents. Because what happens is Elvis comes out in early 56. That's really when he breaks nationally. There's this whole excitement about rock and roll, but there's this whole panic on the part of parents. And essentially what happens is the forces of adult culture manage to kind of squash rock and roll for a little bit from about 1957 really on until the early 60s. So we want to look at the parental response to rock and roll and why it seems such a scary thing. There's a term that I really want you to understand that comes out of sociology, and it's this phrase moral panics, because we see it happen again and again with youth culture in particular. So, um, the idea here is we want to talk about how when there are these outbreaks of rebellion in a culture, usually on the part of young people, that the bigger society comes around and manages to police it, to contain it. And that's a phrase that we call a moral panic. It was invented by a sociologist named Stanley Cohen in 1972. And he was working with in Britain in the early 60s. There had been kind of gang clashes between two rival subcultures of youth. One was called the rockers, right? They kind of dressed up in all leather. And the other was a subculture called the mods. And the mods were very stylish. There's Stanley Cohen. Very stylish, kind of hipster looking guys. And mod produced a lot of great music. The band most famously associated with the mods in the mid 60s was The who would go on to be one of the big classic British invasion bands. So this whole idea of the rockers versus the mods generated this panic in England about how do we control this outbreak of there's the Who in sort of mod style, very pop art sort of style. Uh, but the whole idea was how do we control this? And there's a little bit of a cycle. The Who actually did an album called Quadrophenia in the 70s, which is about mod subculture and it's one of the great teenager albums of all time. But there's a circular nature to moral panics that we can trace with just about every youth culture that comes along. The whole idea is young people, a group of young people begin to be identified as a subculture, right? They maybe have a skirmish with the police or with some adult authority. They are associated with a certain type of deviance. And then that deviance becomes broadcast through the media. It becomes a problem that gets talked about in the newspapers and on television. And then it becomes something that the culture has to either solve or contain. So we'll talk about ways that the culture has responded to a lot of different styles of music. Probably for us, like when I was your guys' age, the style of music that caused a moral panic, believe it or not, was rap. When rap first came out, people freaked out because, first off, they'd never really heard music like this before. But second of all, because rap became associated with groups that had come out of gang areas, that it was considered sort of violent and ugly. And there was we'll talk about when we do Tupac Shakur, how there were all kinds of forces coming out trying to put down rap. The other genre that in the 70s really sparked a moral panic was punk music, because all of a sudden you had young people getting mohawks or putting safety pins through their nostrils and sort of defining themselves as against adult society. So keep in mind this term moral panics. It's really important to understand what that means. It actually didn't start with music. There's a whole history in Europe and America of different types of moral panics. Before the rock and roll era, believe it or not, the big one in America had to do with comic books. When comic books came out in the after World War II, they were scary. They had a lot of exaggerated stuff. And there was one doctor whose name was Frederick Wortham that wrote an absolutely hysterical study called Seduction of the Innocent. And it was all this stuff about how comic books would rot the mind of the youth of America. There he is right there. He looks very concerned. There's a great book about this called The 10-Cent Plague you can look at. But his whole idea was comic books were full of messages of deviance that kids were absorbing. A lot of horror stories, a lot of rebellion stories. But he even looked at Batman and Robin and he said, those guys are definitely gay. And if you read Batman comics, the message is you're going to hook up with an older man who apparently has a bat cave or something. So it's kind of a silly argument. But over and over again, we see these moral authorities want to come out and say the stuff that the kids are into is very damaging for them. In our own time, one of the big issues that we had in the 80s was what was called satanic panic, the idea that heavy metal, right, had something to do with the devil, right? So when I was in high school, that was the era that we actually had people come to the school and warn about the dangers of listening to Ozzy Osbourne or Judas Priest. And they would take a record and put it on the turntable and play it backwards. This was what was supposedly called backward masking. And you'd hear something go, and they would go, didn't you hear that? That's the devil. Join the devil, right? Seemed pretty silly to us, but it had consequences for that type of music. Probably the most famous, because it became a true crime case of satanic panic, involved these three guys in the 1990s, what are known as the Memphis Three. These were three kind of outsider kids who were into Metallica and other heavy metal music, and two boys were murdered in, I believe it's in West Memphis, Arkansas. They were accused of it because they were weird. They seemed on the outside of society. And these three guys actually went to prison for almost 15 years. One of them here, Damon Eccles, was on death row. And it was actually due in part to Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam that they got out of jail in about 2012. Were found innocent. I think they've concluded that it was one of the boys' stepfathers that actually killed him. But at the time, that whole murder sparked a crisis about what is this heavy metal music doing to the morality of our young people. Now, this example may seem a little silly to you. How many of you play Dungeons and Dragons? All right, one person. Well, it's a great game. It's a lot of fun fantasy stuff. But when this game came out, people freaked out about it. One of the first kids to play it was a young guy that went to college, maybe a little too young. He was a very bright kid, but he was maybe a little socially out of it. But he went to college a little too early. But he ended up committing suicide. And there was all of this discussion around his death that they wanted to blame Dungeons and Dragons. So they actually made a movie about this in the early 80s. And I want you to see if you can identify, it's called Mazes and Monsters. And we'll see if you can identify the famous actor. This was one of his first roles in TV, playing the part of this kid that gets kind of lost in Dungeons and Dragons.
Robbie!
Robbie! Robbie!
Robbie! Pardue, what are you doing?
Going to join the Great Hall.
You can't. It's a trap.
I have spells. I'm going to fly.
You don't have enough points. I am the maze controller.
Maze control?
Yes. And I have absolute authority in this game.
Game?
Game.
Does anybody recognize that actor? Tom Hanks. It was one of Tom Hanks' first roles, playing the kid that got caught up in Dungeons and Dragons. So sometimes these moral panics from our side can seem pretty silly. But 20 years ago, the big worry was emo music, right? And the sinister cult of emo music. So they actually had a sort of march where fans of My Chemical Romance, right, took to the streets to sort of say that emo is not satanic music. All right. So any form of this music can be accused of being kind of a cult or drawing people into the irreality of whatever world it creates. So moral panics on our part get pretty silly, but they can have huge consequences for people that get accused of them. All right. So what ends up happening about the time that Elvis goes on the show, where he does Hound Dog and does the bump and grind, is authorities start banning rock and roll concerts because they get rowdy. All the kids want to dance. There's some scuffles, some fights, but municipalities across America start banning rock and roll. And there's all this kind of concern that this music is morbid, it's weird. There's a lot of stuff about racing cars. Some of it gets kind of gratuitously kind of bizarre in terms of imagining. It's kind of like online culture today. You know, young people can be very ironic and kind of glib. We all got a lot of inside jokes. I want to just give you a flavor of a song uh, about a car wreck. A lot of songs became about car wrecks, and they're supposed to be kind of comedy songs, but they are a little bizarre. So there was a guy named Nervous Norvis who did a song called Transfusion. And parents just didn't understand the joke behind these types of songs.
Tooling down the highway doing 79. I'm a twin pipe papa and I'm feeling fine. Hey man, dig that. Was that a red stop sign? Transfusion. I'm just a solid mess of contusions. Never, never, never gonna speed again. Slip the blood to me, bud. I jump in.
So this kind of offended parents, this kind of stuff, and they thought it was sick. They thought it was weird. Where are our nice, clean-cut, church-going kids? They're all wrapped up in this bizarre culture. There's all kinds of death songs in early rock and roll about car wrecks. If you know the Pearl Jam song Last Kiss, you know, that was actually their biggest hit. It's a remake of a late 50s, early 60s song. There's another one called Earth Angel. There's all these gruesome songs about teenagers who die young and how glorious it is, kind of like Romeo and Juliet. And again, parents just didn't understand. Okay. So, this one, they went after this song, Nervous Norvis Transfusion, trying to ban it. Now, this was not a big hit, but parents went after it. And one person on NBC declared there's nothing funny about blood transfusions. Right? So that just gives you the idea of how kind of, overly serious a lot of parents took this kind of stuff. All right. So the question is, again, what's all the fuss about, right? What's all the fuss with early rock and roll? You should know that one of the other non-musical influences on this generation of teenagers was Mad Magazine. Mad Magazine was very anti-authoritarian magazine or comic book, and the government tried to ban it as well because it took a very satirical sort of approach to adult authority. All right, so what did parents panic over in rock and roll in particular? Well, number one was the anti-authoritarianism, because all of a sudden the music became about, don't listen to your parents. A lot of the songs became about the conflict between parents and their children, and the attitude was, to heck with your parents. All right, we'll talk about each of these individually. Frank Sinatra, when Elvis first got big, totally put down rock and roll. Said it's the most brutal, ugly, desperate, vicious form of expression it's been my misfortune to hear. It's written and sung by cretinous goons, and by means of its imbecilic reiterations, that 145, and sly, lewd, plain dirty lyrics, it manages to be the martial music for every sideburn delinquent on the face of the earth. That's pretty intense put down from Frank Sinatra, who, by the way, had been a jazz band sex symbol in his day. Well, here's Frank Sinatra at the time that he said that. And here 20 years earlier is when he got busted for being a juvenile delinquent. So, a lot of this hype over the stuff was just a generation gap where parents didn't understand the music. We'll see that within 3 years of staying this quote, Frank Sinatra and Elvis were like this on live television. Okay? Again, they were also upset, and we've talked about this, about the supposed cultural vulgarity and sexuality, the whole idea that these rock and roll songs were lewd euphemisms for sexuality. That upset a lot of parents. But this is maybe the most important one that freaked people out. And again, I want to emphasize, we are in the segregation era. Their biggest concern with rock and roll was that it was going to lead to what people call miscegenation, or the mixing of races. If we have a popular culture that celebrates the style, the look, the sound of black culture, and white kids want to adopt it, what is going to happen to our pure white culture? And the fear was literal race mixing. Now, again, interracial relationships were illegal for the most part in America at this time. So the whole fear was, if there was very vivid racist element to this, as we'll see, that panic about possibility that this music would lead to black people and white people getting together. Okay? So let me give you just a little taste of how ministers spoke out about it.
These men come down here from New York and from Florida to find out my reasons on rock and roll music and why I preach against it, and I believe with all of my heart that it is a contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today. I 100% believe it. Why I believe that is because I know how it feels when you sing it. I know what it does to you. And I know the evil feeling that you feel when you sing it. I know the lost position that you get into in the beat. Well, if you talk to the average teenager of today and you ask them what it is about rock and roll music that they like, and the first thing they'll say is the beat, the beat, the beat.
The beat, the beat, the beat. Makes you want to dance. Makes you want to have a good time. That scared people. All right. There were a few people that began to sort of understand what Elvis represented as a sort of style icon in the way he was creating for young people this idea of an oppositional culture that was grounded in the idea of youth is cool, as opposed to parents being square. So this is a poet named Tom Gunn, a little older than Elvis, born in 1929, right? And he wrote a poem, the very first piece of literature ever written about Elvis Presley, 1957. And what's interesting about this poem is he says, basically, I don't really like the music, honestly, but I like the look. I like Elvis's look. And what he says is that what is Elvis cool about is he sort of creates this style that kids are going to want to imitate. And his whole idea is he turns revolt into a style, right? Elvis turns the idea of young people revolting against their parents into a fashion statement, a lifestyle, a fashion style, an attitude, right? And he goes on to say, whether he poses or if he's real, no cat bothers to say. Nobody cares if Elvis is authentic. What's important is that pose is a stance which every generation strikes in the war against parents. It's a posture for combat. Now, he doesn't mean literal combat, but what he means is young people want to define themselves against their parents. Now, maybe this is differed a little bit in our generations now. Most of us as adults, some of us share our music with our kids, right? But for the most part back then, he is saying this culture becomes a way for young people to define themselves against their parents. So here you can see an interviewer trying to understand why young people are drawn to not only the music, but the look of rock and roll.
What do you think about them banning rock and roll in Jersey City?
I think it's just great. I don't know why the heck the government told them to stop it. I think it's just great.
These are your grandmothers.
Well, I think if the children want it, they should have it. I don't see anything wrong with it.
You like it, do you?
I do, very much.
What do you think?
Well, I think all teenagers like rock and roll. It's great for everybody. Right.
What does it do for you?
It makes you feel good inside.
It does?
Now you should notice that a lot of these styles that they're wearing, that's a lot of bare shoulders for the early 1950s there. So just keep in mind that the fashion was as important as the music. So let's explore this idea of revolt into style and what did early rock and roll mean in terms of clothing and dress. Well, if you're a young boy, right, if you're a teenage boy, all of a sudden you're dressing in tight jeans, white t-shirts, and those black leather jackets. Those were very important. Plus, you grew your hair long, but you greased it back with Vaseline, and you combed it into a style that Elvis popularized, which is what is known as the ducktail, also called the DA, or ducks, a word means tail with a letter A. You had blue suede shoes, which was a very famous name of a song. So a lot of these songs are celebrating rock and roll style, rock and roll dress. As I mentioned, Marlon Brando was the guy, even before rock and roll took off, that popularized the look of the leather jacket. And all the way really up into the 2000s, the black leather jacket was a key image of rock and roll. All right, there's Elvis's ducktail or the DA. Okay, even in England, there was a subculture called the Teddy Boys that took this idea of sculpting men's hair even further, right? And coming up with these very bizarre sorts of almost like hair sculptures as part of their style or their resistance. All right. Now, let me ask you this, men in the room, have you ever had this experience where your parents, your fathers, made you cut your hair? Nobody? Nobody? See, this is maybe a generational difference. Kids my age, we still got physically taken to the barber shop, right? And it was humiliating. Parents would say this was a form of control. You're going to cut that hair. Probably the reason that at the age of 61, I have the stupidest male hair on this campus at my advanced age is probably still traumatized by a lot of those haircuts that my father, who has been gone from this world for 34 years, made me do. It's kind of my way of saying, you can't control me. All right? Girls started wearing what were called poodle skirts, very hip accentuating skirts, very tight stockings, tight blouses. If you, I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but if you've ever seen brassieres from the 1950s, all right, they were very suggestive in the styles that they conveyed. Lots of makeup. How many of you went to schools where there was a dress code? A few of you. Why did they make you wear a dress code? They wanted you all to be uniform. That's a form of control. One of the funny things you should understand about this university is every once in a while, I like our chancellor, he's a nice guy, he's a good friend of mine, but every once in a while he gets on to us as faculty and he says, you know, you've got a responsibility as mentors that you got to get these kids to start learning to dress. You got to teach them to quit coming to class in pajamas and wearing hoodies, right? And I'm like, that ain't my job, right? I figure you guys are at the age where you're figuring out who you are. You don't need some old man like me telling you what to wear. But there are forces out there that still want to control you, to shape you. All right, here's a good example of a training film that they would have shown if you were a high school student in the 50s about what was right and what was wrong to wear.
Many teenagers are as concerned as their parents with the public's conception of today's youth. These students are portraying what we consider bad taste in school attire and behavior. This student is wearing an ankle bracelet, dungarees, and dropped earrings. This student is wearing an extremely tight skirt and tight sweater.
That's your poodle skirt, by the way.
Open shirt,
There's your black leather
jacket,
jacket.
dungarees are mentioned in the code as not proper school attire. This group is our ideal of the proper school attire and social
Don't they look
behavior.
so nice and harmless and clean cut? How many of you wore ties to school? Sport coats? Okay? This is just a sort of fashion control that is totally out of our, just seems weird to us at this point. But your grandparents grew up with this kind of stuff, and that's in part what they were rebelling against. Look at this guy. This is my father, right? Born 1942, died 1992. Look at how clean cut he looks as a little kid. Well, here he is as a teenager. Look at that. Look at that hussy in the background wearing, right? She probably corrupted my father, right? Got those rolled up jeans, right? That was the style. Imagine something simple as blue jeans conveyed a message for young women that you were fast and wild back in the day because you did not dress like you were clean cut. So this whole idea of fashion being a part of social control. Let's talk a little bit about the leather, because that's got a long-lasting association with rock and roll. There was a rockabilly singer, kind of an Elvis imitator, very important figure, although he did not have a super long career, a guy named Gene Vincent. He did the song that Steve Allen we saw make fun of. It's called Bebop-A-Lula. It's a great song, fun song, 1-4-5 song, very simple. Pruitt here could sing it to us in one listen, all right? So he became famous because not only did he adopt the leather jacket, but he adopted the leather pants. And so he's got a whole look where you are in a leather suit, all right? And that became a kind of rock and roll thing as well. And so just look at how weird his performance style is in this leather outfit. And I want you to understand, I think you can get a sense from this performance of how scary or weird rock and roll could seem to parents. This is a song, it's called Blue Jean Bop. Not, wasn't a huge hit, but it was one of his more famous songs.
I can't keep still, so baby, let's dance. Well, the blue jean bop is the bop for me. Well, it's the bop, it's a don't we. You dip your hip, free your knee, squeal on your heel, baby, 1, 2. Well, the blue jean bop, baby, blue jean bop, baby, blue jean bop. Baby, won't you bop a jean? Ah, now let's go.
See that move where he swings his leg over the microphone, right? That was very weird for parents to deal with. And it was associated with he looked like a hooligan. You got the greasy hair, you got the all leather outfit. Did not look like somebody you wanted your daughter to dress like. So boys would have seen this and they would have been like, that's cool, because it's different. One of the groups in England, the Gene Vincent, the style immediately influenced was the Beatles, who very early in their career wore all leather suits, 1960 to 62. When they got a manager who decided, I can make you famous if you clean up a little bit and dress a little nicer, right? They started wearing suits. But in their earliest stage, they presented themselves as Gene Vincent kind of wannabes, to the point where he actually toured with them. Here's Elvis in his famous 1968 comeback special, where he reasserted his rock and roll identity at the advanced age of 33 by walking out in an all black leather suit. And all the women were like, whoo, 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 whoo. All right. Another guy from the 60s, Jim Morrison, was very famous for popularizing the all black leather look. Probably more contemporary, the last guy that really did it, we started showing the Sweet Child of Mine video the other day, Axl Rose. In the early years of Guns N' Roses, wore all leather suits. Now, today, I'm not sure he can fit into leather pants, but that's a whole different story, all right? So this whole idea of leather, it implies sexuality. There's a sort of weird kink we are probably all familiar with or heard about associated with leather. And that's very much the subtext of this look of the all leather leather look. Becomes very important in rock and roll. Let's talk about some of these themes. Anti-authoritarianism. Again, so rock and roll music, it makes all these kids rowdy. All the parents are upset because they're dancing around. Some of the songs themselves have messages, rebellious messages. So one of the big hits of the mid-50s is a song, again, by Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. It's their second biggest hit. It's not Why Do Fools Fall in Love. It's a song called I'm Not a Juvenile Delinquent. And these guys did not look like juvenile delinquents, by the way. They're dressed like lettermen, which is when you were an athlete in school and you got your school letter. But listen to this song.
I'm not a juvenile delinquent.
No, 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 I'm not a juvenile delinquent. Do the thing that's right, and you'll do nothing wrong. Life will be so nice. You'll be in paradise. I know, because I'm not a juvenile delinquent.
So you can read this song two ways. It's a kid, and again, Frankie Lyman's all of about 12 or 13 when he's singing this song. He's basically saying, I'm a nice clean-cut kid. I'm not a juvenile delinquent. Or he could be making fun of the authorities by saying, oh yeah, I'm not a juvenile delinquent. Okay? Again, it ends badly for Frankie Lyman after his first wave of popularity. This is a guy who'd be dead of a heroin overdose in 1967, 68 by the time he's 25. But at this point, he was just a clean-cut little kid. All right? There's a song in the 1950s, 57 or so, 58, written by the two guys that wrote Hound Dog, right? Lieber and Stoller, for a group called the Coasters. And listen to what they do to make fun of parents in this one.
Take out the papers and the trash, or you don't get no spending cash. If you don't scrub that kitchen floor, you ain't gonna rock and roll no more. Yakety yak.
Don't talk back.
Just finish cleaning up your room. Let's see that dust fly with that broom. Get all that garbage out of sight, or you don't go out Friday night. Yakety yak.
Don't talk back.
You just
All right, so you get the idea. The whole lyrics are rules that our parents probably tell us. Clean up your room, do this, do that, do this, do that. And all of a sudden, it's almost like you can think of this song like Peanuts cartoons. Whenever the parents show up in Peanuts cartoons, whenever the adults do, they always sound like this. You know, it's like you don't hear adults say actual words. You just kind of hear them making noise. That's what this song is saying, yakety yak. But then you have that deep bass voice drop in like a parent saying, don't talk back. All right? So this is a song that's making fun of adult authority. Here's all the rules we got to live by. And the parents, and to us, it's yakety yak. Just moving your lips, parents. Don't talk back. That deep voice became very common in this era of songs as a way of making fun of adult authority. Another song that uses it is by Gene Vincent's best friend, Eddie Cochran. Now, Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran are in a car crash in 1960 that kills Eddie Cochran at the age of like 23. And Gene Vincent shatters his leg and he becomes an alcoholic. So it's a very grim story for the two of them. But Eddie Cochran's biggest hit is a song called Summertime Blues. A lot of bands still do this song because it's a great sort of teenage rebellion song. So get a flavor again of the lyrics.
I'm a gonna raise a fuss, I'm a gonna raise a holler about a working on
why, son, you gotta work late. Sometimes I wonder what I'm gonna do, but there ain't no cure for the summertime blues.
All right, so you get the idea. Summertime, supposed to be our time out of school, to have fun, to run around, and yet people want us to work. We got chores, right? So all of these songs are about what parents tell us to do. And you get in there and all of a sudden there's that deep bass voice again, right? Don't talk back, son, right? Get to work. You've got obligations, responsibilities. Grow up, be an adult. How many of you have ever had parents say to you, you need to grow up? Okay. They don't like you playing that rock and roll music, do they, Pruitt? There is a point where as parents, trust me, you get to the point where you say to your kids, it's time. I mean, mine was 24 and living pretty wild, and I had to say, listen, we've done this enough. Now he's much more controlling of his kids than I ever was. So it's an interesting life journey that you end up going through. All right, let's talk about the biggie, miscegenation, or the fear of race mixing. Here's a standard flyer that might have been put on your car in 1955 or 56. Again, 100% racist. The Klan that was in existence then, or the kind of polite version of the Klan, which was known as the White Citizens Council, that was all the businessmen that didn't want to wear hoods, would put this notice out. Please, parents, stop your young people from buying quote unquote Negro records, right? This black music is going to make your kids be rebellious, right? If you don't want to serve black people in your place of business, then do not have black records in your jukebox or on the radio. The screaming, idiotic words and savage music of these records are undermining the morals of our white youth. Blatant racism. Now, as you might imagine, some of this was really centered in Alabama. So in 1956, there was a singer named Nat King Cole. Wasn't a rock and roll singer, he was a jazz singer. But he came to Birmingham to perform. He was actually born in Montgomery, moved away when he was a few months old. But he came to Montgomery to perform for a segregated audience. And what that meant was the right side of the room, the white people sat, and the left side of the room, black people sat. What happened was, April 10th, 1956, members of the Klan, or some goons, rushed the stage and beat him up, right? And you can see up here some of the cream of the crop of Birmingham that got convicted for attacking him. This is a fascinating story that's never really been told in detail. It'd be interesting to know what happened to these five guys. But clearly, they did not like the idea of black people entertaining white people. And you can see one of them getting drawn away. So, believe it or not, the Klan actually came out against rock and roll because they feared it was a tool of brainwashing young people into not recognizing that the division, the segregation between white and black people should exist. All right. So here's some cleaner cut White Citizens Council types protesting against black music, right? Now, in our day and age, you still hear conservative voices every once in a while saying, don't listen to this music, all right? They might attack black culture, but they don't do it quite as racist or overtly racist. In Alabama, there was a guy, very important guy. I want you to know who this is. His name was Asa Carter. He worked eventually for the governor, George Wallace. George Wallace had a very famous speech up in Tuscaloosa where he stood in the school doorway at the university and he said, segregation now, segregation forever. Well, actually, segregation fell about 2 years later. Asa Carter was the speechwriter who wrote that speech, and he very adamantly came after rock and roll in 1956, right? I'm going to play you, these are just some news items about him from national news. not portraying Alabama very well, but I'm going to give you, now, I've tried to bleep this out, so I'm going to apologize in advance if you think you hear a word that is not a polite word, because back at the time, these racists had no problem dropping the N word. But I want you to understand how racist the attitude toward rock and roll was, and this is Asa Carter. That's not him himself.
Committee to do away with this vulgar animalistic rock and roll bop.
That two-beat pattern is the music brought to the United States of America by the communist conspiracy to corrupt teenagers, and it's in every rock and roll number.
The obscenity and vulgarity of the rock and roll music is obviously a means by which the white man and his children can be driven to the level it is obscure music.
The fact is, America in the 1950s...
What he says there is the obscenity and the vulgarity is a plot. And some of these guys actually blamed the communists. They thought it was a Russian plot to brainwash the young people into behaving like black culture. All right? So again, I want you to understand how racist some of this attitude toward rock and roll was. On the one hand, you have white people ripping off black music. On the other, you have the forces of segregation and racism coming out and saying all of this music would, degrade white culture. And Asa Carter has a fascinating story because this guy is washed up after the civil rights movement, right? And what he ends up doing is reinventing himself. So if you've ever seen the Clint Eastwood movie, The Outlaw Josie Wales, Asa Carter actually wrote that book. He renamed himself Forrest Carter, assumed a whole new identity, and he actually ended up most famously writing a story in which he claimed he had been raised as a Native American. It's called The Education of Little Eagle or something like that. But it's a very famous sort of Western children's book. And the guy just sort of took on a whole new identity and really wasn't outed until the early 1980s. Clint Eastwood, when he made the movie Outlaw Josie Wales, had no idea this guy was a famous member of the Alabama KKK. So it's a very interesting story. All right, let's go back to Alan Freed. One of the things that happens is, again, we talked about Alan Freed, the DJ who named rock and roll, use that term from black culture, that euphemism. And we talked about him being one of the great entrepreneurs of rock and roll. He would stage concerts, but one of the things he also did was he had a television show on in the afternoon in which teenagers would come on and dance to popular tunes. And one of the things that happened was in 1957, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers were appearing on that show. Now, this is not Frankie Lyman, but this happened a little later. One of the things that began to happen at teenage dances was the music broke down the color barrier. So all of a sudden you have white and black people dancing together. Now imagine what the racists saw on television on July 19th, 1957. This is not exactly the scene because it was not saved, but it looked something very similar to this. We have here a white girl dancing with a black man. And stations in the South demanded that Alan Freed's TV show be canceled because it was showing interracial couples dancing together. I want to emphasize how taboo that was at the point. And I don't want to get too far into the racism of why that freaked people out. But basically, we are all aware that there are certain stereotypes that come from the slavery era in which white slave owners feared that black men would take over their women. Okay? So that sets off a lot of these forces of racism at the time. That's why their fear of rock and roll is that it's going to make, it's going to make white teenagers want to be black. And honestly, it did. I mean, we see this with rap music, where a lot of young people begin to adopt the fashions or the style of hip hop. All right. So the government decides it's going to go after Alan Freed because he really seems like the guy who's pushing rock and roll. Okay. So they begin to ban dances. They begin to ban concerts. Here's a very typical announcement from a radio station that for a little bit was playing rock and roll. Look how stupid this guy looks.
Rock and roll has got to go. And go it does at KWK. We're all through playing rock and roll records. This week is record-breaking week here at KWK. And after this week, no more rock and roll will be played on the air. Why do you say? Well, it's a very simple reason. 17 years ago, a system was formed here at KWK, a policy of polling the record shops to decide which records were the most sold, therefore which ones should be played the most on the air. 17 years ago, the system was great. 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, it was a good system. But in the past few months, we've begun to believe that it's becoming antiquated. And so, no more polling the record shops, no more rock and roll.
So the whole idea here is that some of these radio stations are like, we're not going to play the kids the music that they want. We're going to make them listen to what we feel like they need. The popularity of rock and roll is beginning to push older artists out of the charts, out of the Billboard charts. And so all of these adult cultures are coming along and saying, we're not going to allow this music to be heard on the radio or on TV. We're going to make you kids listen to what we think is good music. All right? And you can kind of see why parents were a little scared of rock and roll. Here, for example, is a concert. Now, this comes from Europe. I believe this is Germany. But you can see how out of control some of these concerts got. You can see all the cops trying to control the young people. Get off the stage, kid. All right? Now, let's rush the stage and look at the mayhem that begins to happen. They're tearing up seats, destroying the place, right? Now, this didn't happen frequently, but as you can imagine, this sort of footage was played over and over again. And it just, again, started this moral panic about we've got to settle these kids down. So the government gets involved. And the way that they do it is they began to go after rock and roll DJs for a very specific practice that at the time was not illegal, but that the government made illegal in order to control rock and roll. There was a system of something that was called payola. Payola was the idea that if you come to me as a DJ and say, would you play this song on my radio? And I said, you know what? I'll be happy to play it if you give me co-writing credit on that song, as Alan Freed did, or if you pay me $1,000 under the table, or if you get me some really good cocaine, or if you could hook me up with some hot chicks. Payola was a form of bribery in which DJs were given favors in order to play certain records. And the whole theory on the government's part was rock and roll would never be popular if the DJs were not taking bribes. So they started to come after the most famous rock and roll DJs. And Alan Freed was the most famous. Now, the other guy who was super famous at this time would go on to have a super long career in television. His name was Dick Clark. He had a TV show. He's in his early 30s, so he's not the rock and roll generation. But he had an early TV show in Philadelphia that was shown nationally called American Bandstand. That show would go on all the way until the 2000s. My father and I, when I was a teenager, every Saturday afternoon, we would watch two shows together. One was American Bandstand and the other was Soul Train, which was the black version of American Bandstand, as we'll see in the 70s. All right. The government went after both Alan Freed and Dick Clark. Alan Freed was absolutely livid that they tried to take his livelihood away from him. And he did not respond well to the government probe. He basically told the government to kiss off. So he was chased out of the radio business. He was basically blacklisted. And that's part of the reason that he ended up drunk and dead at the age of 45 in 1965. Dick Clark played it clean. He did what the government wanted. And he's always been considered kind of a sellout ever since. What did they do? They wanted him to divest out of publishing. Again, a lot of these DJs, they would come in and say, if you want me to play this song, you got to give me the publishing rights. So he basically played up to the government and made it through by sort of assuring them that he would be clean and he wouldn't play any dirty songs and that he was not out to corrupt teenagers. One of the things that he did was, like Pat Boone, he actually wrote a teenage advice guide. This was apparently one of the ways in which you convinced adult authorities that you were not out to destroy the morality of teenagers, right? Imagine today if Justin Bieber, right, responded to the controversies around him and came out and said, well, actually, here's an advice guide for teenagers. Brush your teeth 3 times a day. Go to church, right? So they were trying to convince the government that they were squeaky clean, all right? The advice guides are pretty silly here, but what they're encouraging is basically conventional morality. Enjoy the music, but don't let the music make you do bad things because there are consequences to it, all right? And again, I want you to understand that in the 1950s, you know, we're a long way from sexual liberation right now. The whole idea of us being as you know, in the transition out of our teenage years into adulthood, there's no birth control. There's no sex ed. Okay? So their fear really was that the music would lead to a lot of bad consequences. So rock and roll had to clean up its act. Another way that the culture comes to contain the idea of music isn't by the boot of authority so much as what we call co-optation. The government or the popular culture absorbs the threat and then makes a joke out of it. It tames the threat of the moral panic by making fun of it, by parroting it. So you can think of co-optation as rendering a threat harmless by incorporating it into your own culture and just making fun of it. Here, for example, is what happened to Elvis. Now keep in mind, 1957, the government put Elvis in the army. This was done, some say explicitly, or that his number was pulled specifically so they could stop him from being a rock star. All right, so Elvis goes into the army and he loses 2 years of his career. He's honestly never as rebellious again after that. So when Elvis comes out of the army in 1960, the first thing they do is they have a welcome home special on TV, and it's hosted by the guy that just a few years either attacked him, Frank Sinatra, right? And the whole idea here is Elvis is clean cut. He's no longer a threat. This is their TV show together.
We work in the same way, only in different areas. Love me tender, love me sweet.
Singing an Elvis song.
Never let me go.
In his own style.
You have made my life complete, and I love you so. Those fingers in my hair.
Elvis is singing his own style.
Come hither, stare. That strips my conscience bare.
Again, the whole point of this was Elvis comes out of the army and the message was the army has made Elvis grow up. Whatever rebellion he may have had, he's an adult now. He's changed and the music has changed. So we don't have to be scared of Elvis as this cultural threat anymore. He's a nice, clean-cut Army vet, and he's just doing his generation's music the way that Frank Sinatra did for his. So they take the music and they put it in Frank Sinatra style. Here's another way. This is a Flintstones cartoon. And this is how popular culture begins to mock rock and roll.
There's a town I know where the hipsters go called Bedrock. Twitch, twitch, when you get an itch, then you do the twitch in Bedrock. Twitch.
Now again, we got Fred Flintstone being Elvis with a dumb parody of rock and roll. And the whole idea here is that the cartoons are making fun of rock and roll and saying, listen, it's really just harmless. It's silly. It's stupid. It has no threat whatsoever. This is not Cartoon Network, which is very ironic, right? This is not BoJack Horseman or whatever it is that has a message of rebellion to it. This is rock and roll is sort of silly. So the popular culture begins to defang or deneuter rock and roll by telling the culture that it's really just harmless. The biggest way that Elvis, right, was neutered was through the movies. Hollywood came to Elvis almost right away and said, why don't you star in these movies? Because you got a huge audience. You can make more money through the movies than you can through popular music. Elvis made 33 movies from between 1956 and 1969. And there's maybe 3 of them that are good. Most of them are just absolute garbage. And what it did was it changed people's perception of him, right? So what we see here, first movie he made, this is an example of a good Elvis movie. They did a movie based on his song Jailhouse Rock. This is one of the scenes that is considered one of the first music videos. And it shows off Elvis's talents. Now this isn't really rebellious rock and roll, but it gives a sense of his charisma.
Walking through a party in the county.
He's doing his dance moves.
Prison band was there, they began to wait. The band was jumping and the joint began to swing. You should have heard the knocked out jailbird sing, let it rock. Everybody let it rock. Everybody in the whole cell block was dancing to the jailhouse.
Look at those moves there.
Spider-Man.
So that's another rhythm and blues song written again by the same guys that did Hound Dog, Jailhouse Rock, one of Elvis's big hits before he went into the Army. This is what a post-Army movie of Elvis's would have looked like.
Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. And on that farm he had some chicks, E-I-E-I-O.
They've got Elvis singing Old MacDonald.
Loud as they could be, and when those chicks got out of line, chicken fricassee with a cluck cluck here and a cluck cluck there.
That is not rock and roll. That is some piece of schlock that some Hollywood guy wrote, and they made Elvis perform. Now, he wanted to be a movie star, but again, there's maybe 3 out of 33 decent Elvis movies. By and large, most of them were junk that Hollywood cranked out, that young people would have went to, but mostly his original rock and roll audience would have said, he's lost it. There's nothing interesting or exciting or charismatic about Elvis. So Elvis is pretty much done after 1957. He has 2 or 3 years in which the king of rock and roll is most formative. After that, he becomes pretty much a cultural joke. All right. So our other main rock and roll guys, I want to emphasize again, they get into legal trouble. Little Richard quits rock and roll and goes to Bible college. So he's out of the picture after 1958. Jerry Lee Lewis makes a poor choice, marries his 13-year-old first cousin. He's considered taboo, or you can't promote him or make him a major star after 1958. Chuck Berry gets in trouble again with a minor, transporting a minor across state lines. He's in jail in the early 60s. And what ends up happening in 1959 is that people like Dick Clark begin promoting a group of singers who are harmless. They are not by any means rock and roll. This is a group that they call teen idols. Now, I'm going to make what some people may feel is an unfair equivalency here. But the teen idols of the time were the equivalent of boy bands today. Now, nothing against boy bands, but boy bands are generally non-threatening. Okay? They're not sexually assertive. They might whip up that excitement, but they're not provocative in the way that early rock and roll was. And Dick Clark on American Bandstand was a big promoter of teen idols. So one of the first big teen idols that Dick Clark helped sell was a singer named Paul Anka. And this is his most famous song. Notice he's wearing a suit. There's not a leather jacket to be seen.
Put your head on my shoulder, hold me in your arms, baby. Won't you squeeze me once? Show me that you love me too.
Now, if you know this song and you're on TikTok, you might remember a few years ago, there was a TikTok meme that went like this.
Put your head on my shoulder.
Y'all remember this? Y'all remember these memes where they would do these mashups? The joke here is the first part of the meme is playing off of that squeaky cleanness of Paul Anka. And then the lights go out and the real you comes out, right? The real Paul Anka, the sexy Paul Anka, never came out. This guy was white bread. He was like drinking 2% milk, right? And there was a group of these guys. They were called the Teen Idols. And they dominated music from late 58 on up until the early 60s. Some people say it took the Beatles to bring back rock and roll. Now, we're going to challenge that because there was, on the West Coast, there was a great type of pretty rowdy music associated with surf music that was pretty rock and roll. But the whole idea here is the culture managed to defang or to neuter, to take away the threat that rock and roll posed, the moral panic, by co-opting it. The government calms it down by getting rid of Alan Freed, but the cultural in general, right, toned it down. And so by 1959, the idea is the rock and roll fad is over. Everybody's squeaky clean and we're back to these nice, unthreatening ballads. All right, kind of jazz or orchestral ballads. All right, so that's it for today. When we meet on Tuesday, we're going to talk about the end of the first era of rock and roll and the introduction into rock and roll of this idea of nostalgia, of looking back to when rock and roll was most pure. And it occurs because of one specific tragedy, the death of one of the great early rock and roll stars, Buddy Holly, in a plane crash. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and get into quiz number 3. It's in module 3. Should be open by now. Actually, yeah, it should be open. And so our code word is ducktail, after Elvis's hairstyle. All right, one word, ducktail. Everybody get in there? Quiz number 3 in module 3. Who is calling me? Is everybody in there? Okay. If you can't get in there, come down after we're done. Next week, we're going to talk about the Super Bowl a little bit too, because that has been absolutely politicized. It'll be interesting to see what happens both in the pregame and the halftime show. Is there any Bad Bunny fans in the room? No? Or as my mother calls him, Bugs Bunny. I'm a little worried about that Bugs Bunny.